I saw this video on TikTok, which I will share right now. In the comments on this video, someone wrote, quote, "Just a theory, but I think it's because the creators know it's easier to get people to sympathize and care about an animal than it is to get a white majority audience to sympathize with a person of color, which is really messed up, but I can see them doing that," unquote. There is a constant trend in animated children movies and fantasy films where racialized characters are transformed into animals or non-human creatures for the majority of their film. This transformation is often used as a way to minimize or diminish this character's racial identity and the social realities that come with it. By turning these characters into something other than human, this makes it easier for audience members, specifically white audience members, to empathize with these racialized characters without actually having to confront the discomfort of racial dynamics or systemic inequality. Essentially, empathy is made more accessible when the character's humanity and by extension their race is masked. To me, one of the first movies that comes to mind is The Princess and the Frog, where Tiana, Disney's first black princess, spends most of the time as a frog rather than as a human. Although I am sure many of you know what The Princess and the Frog is about, I will be sharing a brief synopsis of the film. Quote, "Hardworking and ambitious Tiana dreams of opening the finest restaurant in New Orleans. Her dream takes a slight detour when she meets Prince Naveen, who has been turned into an amphibian by evil Dr. Facilier. Mistaking her for a princess and hoping to break the spell, Naveen plants a kiss on poor Tiana, thereby turning her into a frog as well. The pair hop along on an adventure through the bayous to seek the help of a powerful voodoo priestess," unquote. With Tiana's transformation, her experiences in The Princess and the Frog are considerably generalized to make her more relatable to a wide audience, particularly white audiences. In the beginning scenes of the film, we are introduced to Tiana as a hardworking, motivated, driven, and ambitious young woman. The film also highlights her New Orleans roots, offering a brief glimpse into the city's rich culture, including the significance of Afro-spirituality, specifically voodoo. As of right now, I won't be going into much detail about that. Once Tiana is transformed into a frog, the film ultimately shifts its focus away from her racial identity. Her otherness is no longer rooted in her being a black woman, but rather in a fantastical, non-human way. This transformation allowed the film to completely overlook or diminish any deeper exploration of racial inequality or the specific challenges she most definitely would have faced as a black woman in 1920s New Orleans. Instead, her struggles are framed in a more universal, generalized, and apolitical way, losing the opportunity to meaningfully engage with Tiana's gender, race, and class. By turning Tiana into a frog, for the majority of her feature film, the story effectively avoids confronting the realities of black identity and instead opts for a universal version of empowerment that essentially centers fantasy over lived experience and lived realities. While it's true that The Princess and the Frog did incorporate elements of Tiana's identity, which includes her background as a black woman in New Orleans and her family values within a cultural setting, the film ultimately avoids engaging meaningfully with her blackness by transforming her into a frog for the majority of the film. This transformation shifts the focus away from her racial identity and lived experiences, allowing the film to dismiss having conversations relating to systemic racism, blackness, and black womanhood. In doing so, her blackness is effectively erased, making the story more palatable and accessible to white audiences who may be uncomfortable confronting race directly. Although, quote, "Tiana transforms back into a human, she continues to wear green dresses, which reminds the audience that inwardly she is still a frog," unquote. Similarly, Louis the alligator was, quote, "willing to do anything to play jazz with the big boys, but he could not do so until he pretended to be wearing an alligator costume." Disney's creative team was trying to allegorically show that black people find it difficult to participate fully in aspects of life in the United States, unquote, without actually having to bring race into it, in fear of marginalizing or ostracizing their white audience. Disney had the opportunity to make Tiana an actual princess by birth, but chose not to. Instead, Tiana begins her story as a working-class waitress who earns her royal status through marriage. While this decision may be defended for many different reasons, it's hard not to question whether this choice reflects an underlying belief that a black princess with inherent power or status might be less relatable or less acceptable to white audiences. The idea that white viewers wouldn't be able to connect with a black royal figure speaks to a broader discomfort with centering blackness and black characters in positions of power power or privilege within mainstream media. Disney's goal was to create a colorblind approach to storytelling, making Tiana's race invisible in the process. Transforming Tiana into a frog early on in the film could have been a deliberate choice in order to create a universal story deemed more suitable for all, but especially a younger audience, which is understandable. However, with this approach, the princess and the frog ultimately ends up avoiding meaningful engagement with race altogether. In doing so, Disney promotes the illusion of a colorblind society where race supposedly doesn't matter. I will say, although The Princess and the Frog had a handful of flaws, it wasn't all that bad, specifically regarding representation. The Princess and the Frog centered a young black woman as its protagonist, as Tiana was the first black Disney princess, and we got to see that in Tiana's physical representation. Tiana had, quote, full lips, a wide nose, dark skin, and curly hair, unquote. Tiana's physical appearance marked a significant step forward in how black women and black beauty are portrayed in mainstream media and films. Although I'm not an expert in spirituality, I will say the film, at times, includes a somewhat relatively respectful and thoughtful portrayal of Afro-spirituality, specifically voodoo, particularly through the character of Mama Odie. With Mama Odie's character, she, quote, affirms the positive representation of black religious practices and beliefs as she uses her magic to change Tiana from a frog back to her human form, unquote. However, with that being said, the film did perpetuate offensive stereotypes about voodoo, especially with Dr. Facilier's character. The voodoo loas that Dr. Facilier often interacts with throughout The Princess and the Frog, quote, are never addressed by name but are represented by colorful, menacing masks and dark roaring spirits, unquote, and similarly don African-style masks that essentially connects their sinister nature with African religion. With this depiction, this essentially symbolizes that voodoo is ultimately bad with the exception of Mama Odie, who in turn is the good version of a voodoo practitioner and is in no way associated with spirits or masks. Within the film, Afro-spirituality, more specifically voodoo, is presented as an evil religion that must be defeated, with the exception of Mama Odie, of course. The Princess and the Frog had the potential to be a groundbreaking film. However, despite some of the positive aspects of the film, it falls short due to Disney's creative choices, particularly the decision to essentially dismiss Tiana's black identity for most of the film. What could have been a rich exploration of race, gender, and culture became a colorblind fairy tale that left many viewers, especially black viewers, wanting more. I now want to talk about Wicked's Elphaba. As many are familiar, Wicked the musical is loosely based on the book Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West by Gregory Maguire. The musical Wicked premiered on Broadway in 2003 and starred Indina Menzel as Elphaba and Kristen Chenoweth as Glinda. For the sake of this video, I will specifically be deconstructing and discussing Cynthia Erivo's portrayal of Elphaba in John M. Chu's film adaptation of the musical that came out in 2024. Elphaba's green skin acts as a metaphor for her racial and social otherness, being that she's the only person in the magical land of Oz with that skin color. Although this otherness she experiences does not explicitly mention this as being racism, she is visibly treated differently because of the literal color of her skin. Because of her markedly different skin color than the rest of her peers, this becomes the primary reason society dislikes and eventually distrusts her, essentially echoing the ways in which racialized bodies are often perceived and treated in real life. Since Elphaba is green, this allows the film to explore themes of oppression, discrimination, and systemic bias without actually having to ever directly name race or racism, essentially making her experience of prejudice accessible to a broader, more generalized audience. Yes, Wicked presents clear themes of discrimination, but in a way that is neutral and fantastical. As I mentioned, Elphaba experiences rejection and prejudice, but this isn't directly named as racism. Similar to The Princess and the Frog, this sort of race-neutral storytelling allows audiences, particularly white audiences, to engage with racism and discrimination in a way that is digestible and universal to them, without having to confront their own role in systems of oppression and inequality. Just how Tiana is othered by being turned into a frog, this lets white audiences empathize with Elphaba's suffering while still not having to directly confront or address racism. By doing this, both Tiana and Elphaba's otherness becomes fantastical, enabling discussions about bias to be had, but through a race-neutral lens that avoids directly challenging race and racism head-on. Therefore, neither of their marginalized identities is ever mentioned in specific terms. Instead, their experiences are presented fantastically, rather than addressed directly or explicitly. When Elphaba is considered wicked in the film by Madame Morrible, this parallels how marginalized groups are often labeled as threatening or dangerous when challenging injustice or inequality. With Cynthia's portrayal of Elphaba, this reflects how women of color, particularly black women, are often often vilified when resisting injustice or oppression. Just how The Princess and the Frog turns away from addressing race to have a more general appeal, especially for a film geared towards families. Wicked similarly generalizes oppression to avoid alienating its audience. Animated and fantastical films like The Princess and the Frog and Wicked use fantasy as a way to represent marginalized identities without actually having to directly engage or acknowledge race, racism, or systemic oppression. By avoiding conversations having to do with race, this promotes a race-neutral and universal approach to discrimination, making topics such as race and racism more accessible to white audiences, allowing them to easily sympathize with these characters, but ultimately this diminishes the realities of racialized experiences. Although I enjoyed both films, it is important to critically engage with and challenge storytelling narratives that contribute to the erasure or dismissal of race.